Welcome everyone to day 2 of the MAAAS 2024 conference, the Mid-American Alliance for African Studies. My name is Glenn Adams. I am the director of the Kansas African Studies Center, and I will be filling in for Dr. Luciano Tosta, who is en route to chair the panel, and en route to speak, but we'll get started. Our first speaker was supposed to be Dr. Lisa Trujillo from the KU Med Center. She's going to be unable to speak this morning due to some other circumstances that arose, but I did want to talk about what she was going to present on, which was a COIL experience, a COIL course, COIL, an acronym standing for Cooperative Online International Learning, that she conducted with a partner at the University of Ghana, the University of Ghana Medical School at Korle-Bu. She, Dr. Trujillo, is a professor in the Department of Respiratory Therapy here at KUMC in the School for Health Professions. And this course happened with funding from the Kansas African Studies Center COIL initiative. So we have a grant competition. In the next month, we're doing another round of it. That's why I'm emphasizing this, in which we provide $5,000 of funding to a faculty person from a KU professional school and $5,000 in funding to a partner from any department in an African university, a university on the African continent, to create and execute some kind of COIL experience. Exactly what that experience is fairly wide open, and the topic of the course, however, is on one of 3 themes that we're emphasizing. So one theme is migration and identity. Another theme is the theme of this conference, disinformation, miseducation, and epistemic violence. And the third theme that's a possibility is environmental justice. So those are the themes of the 3 awards that we want to make in the coming year for any COIL experience that happens during 2025. So although Dr. Trujillo isn't able to be with us today, I wanted to mention that her presentation was going to be about the course that she had created and encourage you to do the same. So I see we have with us Dr. Rika Mama from the School of Social Welfare at the University of Kansas. And Rika, if you're ready to go, we can start with you.
Yeah, good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So I had shared the PowerPoint. I don't know if it's up and running, but I have mine open on my end also.
Yeah, it's not up and running, so we can find the PowerPoint. So let me find our tech person to get the PowerPoint up and running.
Okay, so would you like me to get started in the meantime?
If you have it there and you want to operate it from there, if we operate it from here, we'll have to advance the slides on your command. But if you operate it from there on your end, then you can just advance them when you're ready.
Okay. Let me see. How do I share that? It's okay. I'm just gonna present it without the slides, if that's okay. I'll just go ahead and get started.
Yeah, we can easily get them with the slides too. They don't have the slides. They sent the slides earlier to the email address.
Or they join in on purpose,
I'm sorry, we're looking. There was some miscommunication in the organization about how we were managing presentations.
That's okay.
Okay, so if you have the presentation, then you can do it, then you can please do it. If you want to do it without the presentation, that would be fine, but they don't have a record of the present.
I'll just get started. So good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here. My name is Rika Olga Mama, and I am originally from Sierra Leone, West Africa, and I'm currently an assistant professor at the School of Social Welfare, University of Kansas. So I'm going to be presenting a little bit on my research. My main research area is focused on intimate partner violence among African immigrant women and other minority groups. So what I'll be presenting today focuses on exploring the available support services for African immigrants in the diaspora. So in order to understand that, I completed a scoping review aimed to identify existing resources and what approaches is being used to cater to the unique needs of this population. Okay, can you see me? Okay. So the goal is to inform practitioners and policymakers and other research and also to understand potential strategies to improve support framework for African immigrants. So what is the problem and why do we need to focus on African immigrants as a group when we're considering or we're talking about intimate partner violence? So the research shows that there's definitely a gap in understanding intimate partner violence. Previous research has tended to group African immigrants with other minority groups. So when they conduct research, they tend to group African immigrants with other Black population, and that obscures the unique need of this population because, as we all know, there's a significant changes and challenges and help seeking and cultural and traditional beliefs that affects the way African immigrants understand what domestic violence is compared to other populations. So there's still a lot of unknown about how we go about help seeking and the attitudes and behaviors of this population. So a little bit of background and why this is important. The World Health Organization shows that IPV, intimate partner violence, is a global health and human rights concern. Immigrants women are particularly vulnerable to IPV. I'll be going back and forth between IPV and intimate partner violence. So immigrants women are particularly vulnerable to IPV, showing that they're disproportionately affected. So the World Health Organization also shows that in the United States, as of 2018, there's like 49.8%, which is 3 times higher than the national average of women that are migrating into the United States. And also, research has shown that immigrant women are has higher risk of experiencing IPV due to immigration-related stressors, such as language barriers, cultural barriers, financial status, economical status. And this lower the risk of them accessing available services. So the objective of the scoping review was, I had 4 objectives. The objectives were to understand what available support is there, and also to understand what barriers does this population face, and also what facilitators is there, and also which African countries are represented in the research. I wanted to get a view to see like the previous research that has been done, which African countries has been represented, and what does the literature says about those populations. Okay, so for the methods, I did a scoping review, and I won't stay too long on the methods because I want to focus a little bit more on my results and what my findings are. So I did a scoping review in which I identified articles that has been written between 2007 and 2023. And the reason for that age gap is because, as we all know, immigration systems and immigration laws are continuously and changing, they're rapidly changing, and that affects how people migrate into the United States or the diaspora as a whole. So I did a Prisma chart, and from my search, I was able to find 192 articles. And after going through all the taking out articles that do not fit and duplicate, I ended up with 7 articles that focused on support services for immigrants in the diaspora. And all 7 of these articles that were identified, it was interesting to find that all of them were focused on informal support. So the research is pointing us that a lot of times, the immigrants tend to focus a lot on their informal supports because they tend to focus on communities like churches, family members, instead of going to seek formal support services from like shelters or like, food bank and places like that due to several reasons. So the results. So the types of support. So like I mentioned, a lot of the support was from informal support. So community and social connectedness. Participants sought support from their community, such as their friends, their neighbors, and religious leaders. And family support, it was interesting to see that family support's presented as a double-edged sword. And basically what that means was that it depends on the situation. Sometimes there was due to cultural beliefs within these families. There were some families that encouraged the survivor to stay in that abusive relationship, while there were other families that advocated for the survivors to leave and seek a better healthy relationship. So family and religious support presented as a double-edged sword, in which sometimes some religious leaders and faith communities provided comfort, whilst other religious organizations may encourage or say like you have to stay within the marriage because marriage is a lifelong commitment. So family support and religious support were 2 big ones, and they presented as a double-edged sword, in which, depending on the context, can go either way. Another thing that I found from my results was how culturally responsive the formal support services were. How supportive, meaning that like culturally and linguistic, did they have competent people to be able to translate for survivors that were not able to communicate in English or whatever the language was. And the other part of my results was also a need for education awareness. Survivors became more educated. So I found that survivors who had lived in these countries, let's say America, for example, survivors who were here for like at least 5 to 10 years, as they become more educated about their rights, they became more educated about services available, they were more prone to engage in services compared to survivors who were just arriving and they did not know what their rights were. So definitely a need for education and more awareness on what the rights and available services are. And then cultural competency was also another big part, like incorporating cultural and linguistic services, encourage survivors to seek help. So the more survivors feel like they were accepted, the more they felt like they were understood, the more they felt like there was somebody there that maybe understood the language and they could communicate and explain their experiences better in their local dialects, they were more comfortable to seek support. And then another part of the results was the need for follow-up services. So survivors did indicate that there's definitely a need for follow-up services, fostering communication and trust. As we all know, domestic violence is not a one-time incident that happens just one time. It's a cycle of repeated abuse. So when they feel like they have someone that follow-ups on them, check on them for a longer period, that builds trust, and also it does foster a sense of community, survivors feels like they're accepted, and also continuity of services. And then one big problem with research, and I believe like with all minority group, is funding. There was definitely a need for funding. There is a need for funding to support culturally appropriate shelters, staff training, capacity building, and also encouraging more research to be done. Because like I said, all of the studies that I found 7 studies, and all of those studies were only small-scale qualitative research studies. So we need to conduct more studies that may look at different approaches, such as mixed methods approach, and maybe qualitative approach on definitely like longitudinal studies that will also focus on understanding the long-term effects instead of just surveying a small group of people. So more funding is needed in research in order to facilitate that type of research to get a better understanding of what help seeking means among this group. So what does all of this mean for practice as a roundup? So implications for practice means that developing supports service providers to be more culturally competent. We need more community-based participatory research that aligns with the actual needs and cultural perspective of the community. We need to involve community members. So we need to involve survivors as we make decisions to enhance the relevance and how impactful the services that we think survivors need is actually making a difference in their life. So definitely including community members in our decision making. Implication for education, definitely there's a money for education and awareness, providing targeted education on the types of abuse, what does abuse mean, and also there's also implication for policy and advocacy. A lot of survivors, like I said, focus on informal support due to fear of legal consequences, especially for survivors who may be undocumented or do not have legal status in the countries in which they find themselves. So fear of legal consequences. There's a need for policy advocacy on how we go about addressing that group, and also creating a safe and supportive environment that empowers survivors to help seek. Lastly, as I round up, implication for research, as I mentioned, advocating for increased funding to support larger mixed method studies, and also conducting research to tailor intervention that consider diversity in the origin and also the status and also the history. So the longer participants were in a country, the better proactive they were in speaking up for themselves. And also the better, the more education a survivor had, the more they were supported as far as seeking help and advocating for their own needs. So this is just one of 3 studies that I've completed. The next step of this study that I did was to interview informal supports to understand what their impact has been in providing support for African immigrants. So because of time, I think I will kind of end there. If anyone has any questions, I'm available to answer.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. We'll take a few questions now, 2 or 3, 1 or 2, if people have questions online or in the audience. I think I'll start a question while other people are thinking. So I was wondering, maybe I can come here. Let's see if I can make this work. Yeah, I was wondering whether you found evidence in the review of a tendency toward pathologization of the ways that people who had survived IPV, the way the systems in the host countries treated them. So you mentioned, for example, that there's a tendency to seek care or help from community resources rather than kind of formal services. So the preference for the informal rather than the formal. And in my knowledge, sometimes there's a pathologization of that tendency, as if people really should come to professionals or really should come to the formal person rather than these second best options of informal. But first of all, that's a questionable kind of pathologization. And second, I just wondered if you saw that kind of pathologization in the review that you did and what your response to that would be.
Well, yes, I did, and it's interesting. So, like, I think when you're trying to understand that, like, for the survivors that were in my studies, a lot of them mentioned that the abuse started when they got to their host country. So the abuse did not occur in whatever country of origin they're from. So it kind of started when they got to their host country. So for example, I had the United States had from the seven, four of the articles were from the United States. I believe two was from Canada. Um, and then one was from France. So the abuse started when they got to the host country. So that's another thing that I'm interested to understand. What are those triggers and what are those, how does that happen that, you know, when they were in the home country, they were married previously in their original home country, but then when they got to the in the diaspora in the Western world, that's when the abuse started. So a lot of it tends to link to financial challenges, like the stress of migrating and also other immigration stresses that creates tension and conflict within the relationship. So it will be interesting to understand definitely and compare these groups to find out like people that had experienced abuse in their country of origin and how they navigated that as far as informal or formal support compared to other survivors who may start experiencing abuse in their host country.
We have another question here.
All right, thank you very much, Rita, for your presentation. Well, as someone that has a close relationship with maybe one of the women that you just spoke about, I was thinking, do you think there are disparities in the kind of interventive measures for migrant women when compared to maybe American women, and then maybe white women and African American women, in terms of maybe protection or intervention in cases of domestic violence?
I definitely think the research indicates that there's a difference in approach for sure in intervention, because when I started, I stated that what the research has done in the past, it has ethnically lumped these populations together. So when they're studying for Black, they tend to study and they will mix like people from African origin, and that obscures the unique needs. So my other study that I did when I looked at just survivors, so I interviewed survivors and I asked them about their experience and how has help seeking been for them in the United States. That study was only focused on the United States. There is a lot of cultural indicators that shows that definitely the approach and intervention does not always align compared to when you're advocating and you're helping someone that is of American or Western origin. There's a lot of trust. There's a lot of family and traditional beliefs as far as how domestic violence is approached, as far as abuse is approached within African continents. A lot of trust about feeling safe, a lot of what definition, how marriage is defined or how a relationship is defined, and how do you take something that is happening within the home and take it outside to a complete stranger that you do not know. So that definitely, like the help seeking barriers, I think is the first part that we need to understand before we can even start thinking about how effective the intervention is. Because if survivors do not feel safe, they're not going to go seek help, and that tends to keep them close within their informal support circle that sometimes the abuse go on for so long, because when you go to a family members, they keep reminding you about, you know, you made a promise, you made a covenant, you made a religious issue comes in, whilst especially when there's physical or there's a child involved in the home. That's when I've seen from what I've done in the research, that's when survivors tend to include formal intervention. When there's physical abuse, but if it's just emotional abuse, or if it's just financial abuse, or if it's just verbal abuse, survivors tend to stay longer. African, when I say I'm talking about African survivors, they tend to stay longer in those relationships compared to when there's a physical abuse. So there's definitely a differences in how intervention shapes when it comes to looking at different the different cultural aspects of these two populations.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We're going to move now to the other presentation in this session. Dr. Luciano Tosta, who is here with us and is going to present also not a presentation, right? You're going to just read. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to turn this.
Just 1 second. Okay, thank you very much. This is a really, really work in progress, if there is a definition for it. It's more of a reflection. Before I really start, I wanted to show, if you Google Afro Salvador Bahia, or even if you just Google Salvador Bahia, you will get images like that. That's how the city in Brazil, the first capital of the country, identifies and markets itself. And recently, there has been the city council started this campaign calling it Salvador Capital Afro. So this, I think they started with a festival, but they've done all kinds of activities in different parts of the city. You will see this kind of billboards or in the newspaper. So they call themselves now Capital Afro, the Afro capital of the world. That's what the message is. Okay. While walking on Paje Beach in Zanzibar, Tanzania, in May of 2022, a Maasai trying to sell me necklaces and some other things asked me where I was from. I told him I was from Brazil, which made him smile. As I paid him, he said that he knew two things about my home country. First, he mentioned Neymar, our soccer player, very famous. Then he said that he knew that there was a city in Brazil where there were a lot of people like him. He meant black people. I replied that there were many cities in Brazil where there were a lot of people like him. But I believed that he was talking about Salvador, which happened to be my hometown. I, of course, knew of Neymar's popularity, but I could not help thinking over and over why that man knew about Salvador's African heritage. We did not talk openly about the enslavement of Africans in the Americas, neither explicitly about the African heritage in Brazil. His comment was not exactly about that, and I did not feel it was the right moment and place for such a discussion. Although I happened to be in Tanzania participating in a Global Humanities Institute whose focus was on medical humanities in global Africa. One research interest that I have when conceiving of the notion of global Africa is the relationship between Africa and Afro. That is, to what extent one can be used or not to express the other. More specifically, I'm curious as to whether the hybridized Afro-diasporic blended identity has been able to attempted or ended up encompassing the original African reference that it indeed embodies. I look at Salvador Bahia as a case study, but not so much the extent to which Brazil and Salvador specifically appears in the overall imaginary of Africans. Many and most don't know about Salvador, and the African diaspora elsewhere, or in Cuba, another place that I'm interested in and have been researching particularly, but also at the ways in which Salvador has become a hub for the celebration and discussion of Africanness and what implications that might have. The City Council's policies to implement the Salvador Capital Afro, I showed you the images, program in the past 5 years, which is designed to promote Afro tourism, revealed that the mayor has more than his eyes on the potential of the city to attract Africans as well as Afro descendants from the diaspora. The program's Instagram page brags about the fact that the city is, I quote, a cidade mais preta fora da África, the blackest city outside of Africa. And it is that identity that they have been trying to promote and sell. One can easily spot a Salvador Capital Afro billboard in strategic parts of the city nowadays. The first one at the airport already. I quote, Viva Salvador, viva Bahia, viva o povo brasileiro, viva o povo da diaspora. Hooray to Salvador, hooray to Bahia, hooray to the Brazilian people, hooray to the people of the diaspora. This is how Silvio Almeida, then Minister of Human Rights and Citizenship of Brazil, an Afro-Brazilian, ended his speech during the opening of the Conferência da Diáspora Africana nas Américas, which happened in Salvador from August 29 to 31st of this year. Almeida reminded his audience of the recent inclusion of the diaspora, approximately 170 million people, as the sixth region of the African Union, and remarked that the African territory is real, but it's also imagined. I'm sorry about the pronunciation. My Yoruba hasn't helped much, and I learned that in Nigeria this June. The Oni Adeyeye Enitan Babatunde Ogunsui of Ile-Ife, Nigeria, declared Salvador the Yoruba capital of the Americas on June 10th, 2018. The Conferência da Diáspora Africana nas Américas is just one of many events that have taken place in Salvador in the past decade that emphasize the need to recognize and strengthen the city's and Brazil's connection to Africa, reaffirming its role as a focal point for Afro-Brazilian identity and African heritage. The 2018 edition of the World Social Forum, an international event that emphasized social justice, took place in Salvador. One of its themes was the decolonization of knowledge, which generated discussions on Afro-diasporic identities, African cultural heritage, and the need for post-colonial reconnections between Africa and the diaspora. Many workshops and panels addressed issues related to African and Afro-Brazilian cultural, social, and political concerns, positioning Salvador as a meeting ground for African and diasporic intellectuals. The city has hosted a number of Pan-African dialogues and conferences over the past decade, including events organized by the federal, state, and Catholic universities and cultural organizations to discuss Afro-Brazilian identity, African culture, and the African diaspora. These events often include African intellectuals, artists, and activists who come to Salvador to engage with the local community on themes of decolonization, racial justice, and cultural preservation. The city's universities, including the Federal University of Bahia, UFBA, have expanded their exchange programs with African universities, particularly in Lusophone African countries such as Angola and Mozambique, as well as Nigeria and Benin. These academic connections focus on Afro-Brazilian and African studies, and they help to strengthen intellectual and cultural ties between Brazil and Africa. Such initiatives have led to more cross-cultural research projects, joint academic programs, and student exchanges that contribute to a deeper understanding of African history and its influence on Afro-Brazilian identity. The creation of Unilab, the Universidade da Integração Internacional da Lusofonia Afro-Brasileira, let me see if I can translate that, the University of the International Integration of Afro-Brazilian Lusophonia, in 2011 in Ceará, was also a great step towards the integration between Brazil and Luso-African countries. Its institutional mission is, and I quote, to generate human resources to contribute to the integration between Brazil and the other country members of the community of Portuguese-speaking countries, especially the African countries. There are also plans for the creation of the Universidade Internacional Federal África Brasil in Bahia. So the International and Federal Africa Brazil University. UFAB would be located in São Francisco do Conde in Bahia, in the Recôncavo, the area of the Recôncavo Baiano, a very Afro place, and aim beyond the PALOPs, the countries of Portuguese, where Portuguese is speaking, focusing on collaborations with the Global South, aiming at Africa and its diaspora in Asia and the Americas. Unilab currently has a campus called Campus do MAAAS in São Francisco do Conde. Salvador has been home to several Afrocentric fashion and arts events that connect the city to African cultural expressions. In 2020, the Afro Fashion Day event, a platform showcasing Afro-Brazilian designers, models, and artists, included African-inspired fashion and themes that explored African identity and diasporic creativity. The Bienal do Livro da Bahia, which takes place every 2 years, has featured prominent African writers, intellectuals, and thinkers, creating literary cultural partnerships between Brazil and Africa. The City Council has also signed bilateral cooperation agreements with some African cities and countries to promote cultural education and economic activities. For example, Salvador and Lagos in Nigeria have established cultural links targeting their mutual interest in promoting Afro-diasporic heritage. These agreements include academic aspects, economic cooperation, and cultural programs. Salvador has partnered with cities in Angola, reinforcing ties between Brazil and Lusophone African countries. The Museu Nacional da Cultura Afro-Brasileira, the National Museum of Afro-Brazilian Culture, opened in Salvador in 2022, further strengthening the city's role as a center of African heritage. The museum aims to preserve and showcase the contributions of African culture to Brazilian society, particularly in Salvador, and it promotes dialogues between Brazil and some African nations. It frequently collaborates with African institutions and artists, showcasing African art and history alongside Afro-Brazilian heritage. Salvador has also had the Mostra de Cinemas Africanos, the um, uh, African Film Festival, highlighting the cultural, political, and social issues shared by these regions. The festival, which is held annually, promotes dialogues between the African continent and its diaspora through cinema. Visual culture connects African countries with Brazil, using cinema as a medium to explore African identity, history, and contemporary challenges. In Mapping Diaspora, African American Roots Tourism in Brazil, Patricia Pinho from the University of California studies African American roots tourism in Brazil, more specifically in Bahia, through three main focuses: how this tourism allows for the construction and transformation of diasporic identities, noting how racial and national identities interact with, complement, or contradict one another, the transnationalism of Black solidarity, which extrapolates the geographic limits of the nation, and finally, the geopolitics of the Black diaspora, analyzing the different power positions of two Black communities, one situated in the global South and the other in the global North. It's very interesting how she talks about, wealthy, or at least uh, uh, um, in good financial conditions, Blacks, African Americans who go to Salvador and encounter the very poor. Not that they are only very poor, but in many situations, that's who they are dialoguing with, the very poor servants and workers of the city. According to Pinho, roots tourism in Brazil has subverted the secondary position that the country has, in a way, occupied within the Black diasporas, where US conceptions of negritude predominate. For her, roots tourism reveals and accentuates the importance that Brazil has in these diasporas. She proposes that roots tourism subverts the idea of tourism as a multiplier of global inequalities and discusses the challenges that it presents to the hierarchies of the Black Atlantic. Salvador's non-official attractions have brought Africans and African Americans to the capital of the state of Bahia. Afro-Brazilian art form capoeira is taught in several African cities, as well as in Afro-diasporic cities such as Havana and New Orleans. I myself had the opportunity to co-teach capoeira in Dar es Salaam in 2022 and participated in a roda and in a class in Havana this March. But capoeira has engaged in other conversations too. In 2008, for example, Mestre Sabiá, the leader of capoeira group Ginga Mundo, currently living in Barcelona, brought 3 masses of Laja, a martial art from Martinique that's similar to capoeira, to Salvador. They gave workshops and dialogued with capoeira masters and practitioners. Laja masters expressed the desire to follow capoeira's global path during the event. Many times, African American capoeiristas, capoeira practitioners, find a connection to Africa through their experiences in capoeira. Pelourinho, Salvador's historic center and UNESCO's World Heritage Site, has increasingly become a space for celebrating African heritage through music, dance, and educational initiatives. Afro-musical groups such as Olodum, famous for its percussion-based and African-inspired music, have held various events and collaborations with African artists. The same is true about the pioneer Ileaie, whose headquarters, Senzala do Barro Preto, is located in the Curuzu Liberdade region, another important area for the Afro-Brazilian community. In my previous work, I've explained how these groups have been instrumental in establishing a connection with Africa through their music and aesthetics. Olodum has collaborated with Afro-Cuban musicians and bands, building on the musical heritage that both regions share. Eliae has performed several times in Africa. Upon my invitation, Mario Pan, the artistic director, spent a month at the University of Kansas in April of this year. Salvador has continued to serve as a hub for African-based religious practices like Candomblé, which is rooted in the Yoruba religion of Nigeria and Benin Republic. Cultural exchanges and religious pilgrimages between Bahia, West African countries, and Cuba have increased significantly. Candomblé practitioners sometimes learn Yoruba, and a few high priests or priestesses have traveled to Nigeria and Benin for spiritual connections and rituals, reinforcing Salvador's role as a bridge between Africa and the African diaspora. And the Candomblé ceremony is all in Yoruba or Kimbundu or some African language. I learned in Ile-Ife in Nigeria that the current Yeye Oshun, the leader of the Oshun temple, is a Brazilian woman. Brazilians have recently gone to Cuba to get consecrated in Santeria, as well as to initiate in Ifa in Nigeria or Voodoo in Benin. Yoruba religious leaders from Nigeria also visit Salvador and participate in festivals and rituals, further deepening the spiritual connections between the city and Africa. So I talk more about Afro-Brazilian religious festivals, like the Iemanjá Festival, the Boa Morte, the Good Death Sisterhood in Cachoeira, which is a syncretic. They're Catholic, but they also practice traditional Afro-Brazilian religions. And there is huge tourism from the US, African American tourism, to the Good Death Sisterhood Festival in Cachoeira as well. There has been also increased collaboration between African American civil rights activists and Afro-Brazilian racial justice movements. African American scholars such as Angela Davis have visited Salvador and participated in conferences. We've had recently Oprah Winfrey, rapper and actor Ludacris, Will Smith, Steve Harvey, Beyonce, and it keeps going. They're all and participating, dialoguing with the city's identity. Salvador is often referred to as the Black Rome due to its significant Afro-descendant population, its preservation of African cultural practices, and then I explain how the term came about. So to finish, Salvador's role in global African discourse exemplifies how a diasporic city can become a vital space for reclaiming identity, promoting solidarity, and resisting cultural domination. It can be understood as a transnational cultural node that preserves and transforms African cultural identity through a process of diasporic recontextualization. As a diasporic city, it serves as a cultural bridge between Africa and the world. It acts as a repository of cultural memory, where rituals, music, art, language, and other forms of expression continues to thrive, even as they evolve in response to local conditions. Salvador helps to reshape the narrative around African culture, positioning it as a global force rather than a peripheral one. It facilitates the global circulation of African culture, becoming a key player in the production and dissemination of African cultural forms. It is also a crucial space for the negotiation of identity and belonging. The city becomes a living archive of African memory, where history is preserved, reinterpreted, and passed down. Thank you.
Many thanks to Luciano. And now we'll open the floor for questions or comments for the in-person or online audience. We have one in person.
Thank you. Brother Luciano, thank you for a beautiful presentation. My question is twofold. Number one, can you define in a few words Africanness? And two, how do Afro-Brazilian live and portray their African identity? Thank you.
I won't even try to define Africanness. To begin with, uh, uh, the better word would be Africannesses, right? If we are to use something that can encompass or can define uh, um, uh, something big, unique, multiple, and that cannot be contained in one maybe in one word. But the way I'm using is exactly how the quality of being African or expressing African identity. That would be a large way. And the other question was? Mhm. Right. So it also there isn't one single answer. I was recently, for example, in Cuba, and if you go to Havana, you see one thing. And if you go, it's more Nigeria in terms of the religion that interests me. Orisha-based in worship. If you go to Santiago de Cuba, which to me is more similar to Salvador, it's more like the Benin Republic's voodoo in terms of practice. I think portraying the African identity is a way to show resistance and resilience. It's a way to reclaim a history. It's a way to fight for space. This is something that the Afro-Brazilian community says a lot. We want spaces. So I say like Salvador, where 80 or maybe some will say more % of the people are Afro-descendants. Still, there are very few comparatively who are in positions of power, for example. Right? There was one mayor who would identify as Black. So the African identity is a way for this group not only to celebrate heritage, to celebrate origins, so many times in mythical Africa, a land that doesn't exist, only in the memory that has remained. But it's also a political statement. So it's a way to gain space and political power. I hope it answers the question here.
Okay. Okay, so Prof, you were trying to make use of cultural activities in Salvador and how it does link with Africans, like some festivals and music like Iliaye, everything like that. So I was kind of wondering that, okay, this cultural activities kind of like make it obvious that there is a connection of Afro-Brazilian in Salvador. But I'm thinking like, aside the connections, does these festivals, the cultural activities goes beyond the connection? Like, does it kind of like shows like a support services towards the Black? Does it make the Blacks more like more dominant in Brazil or more influential in Brazil? Or something like that?
So, because we're running short time, we'll gather the questions and then you can respond to all. So one.
My question is fairly similar to yours. I was wondering, as a very marginalized city historically, with all of these new connections and new festivals and new marketing by the government, how all of that has changed life on the ground, particularly in the way that Salvadorians view themselves. Has that changed? Has the way that other Brazilians view the city, has that changed? I'm just curious how that has morphed over the past maybe 20 years.
Thank you.
Hi. So my question is, how do the people identify their Africanness? Is it by their color, or is it by that they could trace their history, that they came in through the slave trade era? And I think the bigger question is going to be, how is Africanness defined? Is it only by skin color? Then if so, there is a question mark, because we do have a lot of African countries that are whites, like whites. So how do they identify or quantify their Africanness?
Yours is the most difficult one, but let's see if I can do this fast. The festivals do not usually have a social aspect tied to them. Sometimes the organizations connected to the festivals, they in their identity, they do have social work, right? They have projects, they work with the community and so on. But the festivals themselves, sometimes what happens is a mixture between the profane and sacred, right? So you have the religious part, but at the same time you have a party, right? You have the people having fun, enjoying themselves. But traditionally there isn't a social dimension to them. Okay. Um, um, when Obama was elected president, the president of Olum, this Afro-Brazilian group, Michael Jackson sang with them. He wrote a newspaper article for Tarde, the main newspaper. He said that if Obama and Michelle were to come here, they would feel ashamed, because a city that claims itself and that is Afro-diasporic, really the Afro-descendants are still in very bad situation. Now, there has been some change, right? Especially after Lula's the current president, his second term, now he's in his third now, there have been many changes, and including public schools need to teach African history, for example, right? Affirmative action and etc. So universities, most universities have some kind of quota system, and that has made a difference. We have ministers now we have judges, we have medical doctors, but still significantly that's not enough, not even close to enough. Okay. So the one about Africanness, again, as I said before, Africanness is yes, the color, but not the color. The color, the traditions, the history. For example, in Candomblé, nobody will question whether Candomblé is an Afro-derived religion, and you can be white. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The religion has the identity, carries the identity. Your skin color doesn't matter much. But yes, when Brazilians say African, they mean black. They don't mean white Africans. No, they don't care about white Africans. Um, um, and it's very complicated now because colorism became a thing. You know, in the country, we had, like in the U.S., they have the one drop rule. If you have one blood of African heritage, you consider yourself white or black. In Brazil, it was the opposite. There was a whitening ideology that existed for a long time. So mixed people were supposed to, or were led, they identified as white, not as black. So, but there was a big work to make negros e mestiços, black and mixed, to make them mixed identify as black too. But then colorism came, and then people say, it doesn't matter to me if your grandmother was black, if your great-grandfather was enslaved, because your skin is white. So the police does not stop you when you're driving. So it's very complicated now. But the traditions, they embody the, 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 the mythical Africa that they celebrate.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. Let's give a round of applause to both of our speakers. And we are going here to take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back for the third and final keynote address of the conference. But then we have more to come after lunch, so don't go away after the third keynote. And I'll see you in 15 minutes.